Hi everyone, hope you're doing good. Welcome back to another genre comparison episode. In this episode, we're going to be comparing progressive metal and Djent versus Deathcore. Now, this is the 7th episode in the series. You can watch the whole series in a playlist on the channel if you've missed any. Basically, if you've never watched any of these before, we take two genres of either rock or metal and we compare them. We go through the history of the genre and similarities, differences, and then I sort of give my final thoughts at the end. I've decided to change up the formula a little bit for this episode and maybe episodes in the future, making them a little bit more interesting, a bit shorter, less time consuming, a little bit more engaging, hopefully as well. Because before, the episodes, they wasn't getting many views, they wasn't doing as well as I hoped they would. There wasn't a lot of audience participation or audience retention, and they were taking ages for me to make, and they started to become a little unenjoyable for me to make them. So hopefully they'll do a little bit better now that I've actually found an audience that might enjoy them and appreciate them a little bit more. And also, hopefully, now that they'll be a little bit shorter, they might do a little bit better as well. And they might be a little bit more fun to make for me. So before we get into the video, if you're new and you like the content I've been making, please consider subscribing and checking out the playlist on the channel. Drop a like if you go on to like the video. Please share with anyone you think might like my content. All feedback and comments are much appreciated. And a massive thank you to everyone who's already subscribed and for watching and commenting. Now let's just get straight into this. Firstly, we're going to start with the brief history of progressive metal. It first came to be in the mid-1980s, being heavily influenced by traditional heavy metal and progressive rock, with bands such as King Crimson, Rush, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Iron Maiden and Judas Priest being massively influential on the genre. Like in progressive rock, they use elements of jazz, classical and Middle Eastern music, but with a heavier guitar tone and more heavy metal elements. Traits include extreme technical proficiency from all the musicians, unorthodox harmonies, complex rhythms with frequent time signatures and time signature changes, long technical guitar solos and intense syncopation. Bands tend to use either 6 or 7 string guitars. The origins are in the UK, the US, Germany, Canada and Scandinavia. Lyrical themes are very similar to prog rock, including inspiration from poetry, social and political issues and scientific exploits. The first progressive metal bands that emerged in the 80s include Queensryche, Dream Theater, King's X, Shadow Gallery and Fate's Warning. Also, thrash bands Metallica and Voivod had some influence on the progressive metal movement. In the 90s there was a massive emergence of bands. The list includes Tool, Symphony X, Atheist, Meshuggah, Cynic, Liquid Tension Experiment, Psychotic Waltz, Siege is Even, Erion, Nevermore, Pain of Salvation and Puya, the most notable. Also, death metal bands such as Death and Opeth created progressive death metal in this time period as well. In the 2000s, there was another rise of progressive metal bands. These include Mastodon, Planet X, Obscura, Between the Buried and Me, Devin Townsend, The Faceless, Vector and Gojira. There were also many bands that adopted the progressive metal style or used elements of it in their later music. Some of these include Avenged Sevenfold, Iron Maiden, Enslaved, Mudvayne, Edge of Sanity, Pestilence and The Dillinger Escape Plan. Through the rise of progressive metal, loads of subgenres were created. This is mostly down to bands in certain genres using progressive elements in their sound and in their music. Some of these prog metal influenced subgenres include progressive thrash, progressive death metal, progressive doom, progressive black metal, progressive avant-garde metal, progressive metalcore, mathcore, and technical death metal. However, the biggest subgenre to come from prog metal is Djent. Djent first came to be in the late 90s, with Meshuggah creating the foundations for the genre. However, they didn't really know it at the time. The genre came into fruition in the late 2000s and the 2010s. It's heavily influenced by extreme metal, groove metal, avant-garde metal, and progressive metal, with bands starting out as progressive metal bands before adopting the Djent style when it first became a thing. Traits include high gain, distorted, low pitched guitars, heavy use of palm muting, syncopated riffs, polymeters, virtuosic soloing, progressive rhythms, polyrhythmic grooves, and high technical proficiency. Bands tend to use 7, 8, and even 9 string guitars. Lyrical themes are the same as prog metal. Its origins are in Sweden for Meshuggah, basically inventing it, the UK, the US, Canada, and other parts of Europe. Main bands in this genre include After the Burial, Animals as Leaders, Born of Osiris, Monuments, Periphery, Tesseract, Vola, and Within the Ruins. Now we're going to move on to a brief history of deathcore. It first came to be in the late 90s into the early 2000s, but gained popularity in the late 2000s. The genre is a combination of death metal, hardcore, and metalcore, also being influenced by hardcore punk and some nu metal, a little bit of djent and some progressive metal in there as well. Also, some bands have a slight influence from black metal and symphonic and classical music. Traits include death metal style guitar riffs and blast beats, metalcore style breakdowns, downtuned guitars, trem picking, and technical guitar solos. They tend to use 7 or 8 string guitars. Vocal styles include growling and screaming, and they very rarely use clean vocals. Lyrical themes include the brutality of death metal lyrics, such as like death, gore, and mutilation, stuff like that. And also the inner struggles of some metalcore lyrics, like mental issues and stuff like that. The origins are in the United States and the United Kingdom. The first deathcore bands emerged in the late 90s to the early 2000s. These include Antagony, Despised Icon, The Red Chord, Dead Water Drowning, All Shall Perish, Job for a Cowboy, and Bring Me the Horizon. After this, towards the late 2000s and early 2010s, deathcore rose in popularity with many more bands coming through into the mainstream. These include Suicide Silence, Whitechapel, Thy Art is Murder, Carnifex, Emmure, Chelsea Grin, and Oceano. During the 2010s, the genre went from strength to strength, with many new bands coming through. Bands include Infant Annihilator, Lorna Shore, Slaughter to Prevail, Shadow of Intent, Fit for an Autopsy, I Declare War, Heaven Shall Burn, Rings of Saturn, and Make Them Suffer. As of yet, there hasn't been any subgenres created from deathcore as yet, as it's still relatively new-ish. Now we're going to move on to the similarities of both of those genres. Both genres have a lot of technicality through the guitars and the drums, including like solos, drumming techniques, and riffs. I think it's more on the prog metal side though. That's just so highly proficient and unbelievably technical, but also deathcore is a little bit as well. They both play downtuned guitars, mainly 7 strings, but they both experiment with crazy tunings. Some deathcore bands like Whitechapel play 8 strings and they tune to like drop G or something mad like that, some weird tuning. Both are fairly popular in the mainstream metal scene. Yeah, for slightly different reasons. Quite a lot of younger people are all into the deathcore, and some of the older people are into the more progressive metal, although quite a lot of young people are into it as well. Yeah, but never really into like proper mainstream, that world that we don't like to talk about here. There are some prog metal influences and elements in deathcore. Yeah, there's a Djent influence, as well. Sort of all that stuff gets a little bit sort of intertwined. Born of Osiris and the Faceless sort of merge into both sort of progressive metal and deathcore as well. Djent and deathcore are fairly similar, and they both come up at the same time. So yeah, the only thing with Djent is that they don't have deathcore style vocals and riffs, but some of it is a little bit similar. It's probably the more groovy sounding riffs sound a little bit sort of djenty. The production quality is great for all of these bands, mainly because they've got the backing to be able to create such fantastic sounding albums. Now we're going to quickly move on to the differences of the two genres. They both have completely different influences in terms of like musical style. Prog is very into the jazz and the sort of heavy metal, and then deathcore is just death metal, metalcore, the most extreme stuff you can find. Djent is a little bit similar to deathcore in style of sort of influences, sort of groove metal and extreme metal, but yeah, prog metal and deathcore are completely different. Completely different song structures and songwriting as well. Just how the two styles are just sort of structured. Progressive metal is very progressive, and then deathcore is very sort of deathy sort of sounding, but there are little elements of progressive in there. The lyrical themes and the vocal styles are massively different. Yeah, you wouldn't get guttural vocals in progressive metal, or not a lot anyway. And yeah, compared with deathcore, it's very rare you find clean vocals, and also lyrical themes are very different as well. Popularity in the underground metal scene. Deathcore sort of is a bit more hated than prog, so that's probably why I put that point in there, because deathcore is a little bit more hated than prog. Prog's not really hated by anyone really, apart from like people that think progressive fans are a bit snobby, which they can be a bit, but I mean, quite a lot of deathcore fans like progressive metal, so that's sort of it. And some people prefer one to the other, especially like progressive metal fans probably wouldn't really like deathcore that much, but as I just said, deathcore fans like a bit of prog metal and all metal genres really. Now lastly, we're going to move on to my final thoughts of both genres. There are certainly some differences between these two, and set of fans as well in the metal scene, but I honestly really love both. I really enjoy both for different reasons. I love the technical proficiency and the genius of progressive metal. At times it can be pretty heavy as well. Really like Mastodon, Tool, Dream Theater. John Petrucci is just an absolute god of guitar. I haven't listened to a lot, but I want to check more out in the future. More Dream Theater especially. I haven't really listened to any Dream Theater. I've barely heard any Djent, but I might do again in the future. I might dip my toe into a bit of Djent, because what I've heard is pretty cool actually. I love progressive elements in metal music as a whole. The level of creativity and musicianship's completely off the scale. All are absolute virtuosos of their instruments and unbelievable songwriting. The legacy and continuation of progressive music in metal will live on forever and ever and ever. As for deathcore, I absolutely love the brutality of the vocals and the music. Yeah, I'm a massive fan of deathcore stuff. I'm still a little bit new to it, but the bands that I have checked out, like Suicide Silence, Thy Art Is Murder, Whitechapel, and the new Carnifex as well. All brilliant. I absolutely love it. I think it's probably the heaviest metal genre there is to listen to, but it still has like a groovy, catchy sort of elements to it as well. The drumming is absolutely out of this world. The guitar playing as well is brilliant at times. Some really awesome solos. It's one of my favourite genres in metal for sure. And yeah, I know a lot of people don't like it. A lot of like older metal fans don't really think a lot of it. But you know, the mass popularity of the genre just allows more people to get into metal, which I think's great. But yeah, I think the influence of the genre will be known more in the next generation of metal bands, I think. But yeah, it's definitely here to stay, which is awesome. So that has been my video comparing progressive metal and Djent with deathcore. I'd love to know what you think of all of these genres. What do you think to the new formula? Do you think it's better or worse? Anything I can improve? Anything I've missed? I'd love to know all your feedback on this. And the next one that I'm hoping to do is hard rock and blues rock versus experimental and instrumental rock. And then after that, I have another 4 in the pipeline that I am hoping to do. Only if you want to see them. If you enjoyed this one and you want to see more, then please let me know, because I'll do them if you want to see them. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks ever so much for watching. Until the next time, keep it metal.